piece of the weekend that you guys were told would actually happen. And that is we're going to talk about forgiveness in session 3. So session 3 here, session 4, which we'll have prior to lunch, which I would definitely pay attention to the time, but we'll definitely get out on time. And then tomorrow, session 5, we're going to focus on forgiveness for the next 3. And this is really, I didn't come to grace first. I started with forgiveness. So as I'm looking at, was I not on earlier?
No.
Was I just, okay. That's probably one of those things that probably wasn't saying anything good. I got to forgiveness first, and then that led me to grace. But I think the appropriate order is grace first, and then that foundation of acceptance and commitment, and then forgiveness. And we recognize we deeply want connection. We want to be accepted, especially by the important people in our life. But every so once in a while, we don't feel it. Every so once in a while, we feel judged or neglected or hurt in a variety of ways. So we're going to talk about forgiveness. Gracious couples forgive one another. The best illustration I've ever read of this came from Frank Fincham. I'm going to set this up a little bit, and we're going to talk about this in a couple of ways. I'm going to talk about a psychological perspective on forgiveness, or maybe a therapeutic perspective. So if you get into the counseling books, when they say this is how you should do counseling for forgiveness. But then there's also a theological perspective, and they don't always line up. And so we're going to talk about both of those perspectives. I think we can embrace both of them, and they are both helpful for us. But we are going to see some of those differences. All right, so Frank Fincham tells the story. There are these two porcupines, and they live in Alaska. Now, the first time I heard this story, I thought, porcupines don't live in Alaska. They do. I Googled it. They do. They're there. Alaska is part of the natural range of porcupines. I don't know why. So porcupines are in Alaska, and it's cold. It's night. It's cold. They're shivering. They notice each other. Oh, they're shivering. They notice each other. And they're like, we could get warm together. And so they move toward each other. But what do porcupines do when they get close? Yeah. They prick one another. They can't help it. That's how they're built. It's inevitable. We want connection. We want to be known. We want to be seen. We want to feel close. But it is inevitable that as I move closer and as I make myself vulnerable, every so once in a while I'm going to get hurt. And every so once in a while I'm going to hurt my wife. It's inevitable because of my nature. Porcupines can't help it. I can't help it. It's inevitable. And so now we have a choice. When that happens, what do we do when we're hurt? And forgiveness is a pathway. There are some other pathways, and we'll investigate these very, very briefly. We can get even. We've talked about that. That's kind of the scorekeeping model. Someone hurts me, I can hurt them back. We keep it even. And inevitably what happens is if someone hurts you and you hurt them back and you think, good, now we're even, they also say, yeah, that's good, now we're even. That part was irony. They do not say that, right? They're like, no, now we're out of order, I'm going to get you back. And you're like, oh, yeah, no, I'm going to get you back, right? We're escalating. Again, inevitably how we're going to respond to one another because we have a sin nature. So we can get someone back. If someone hurts us, we can get them back. That's revenge. We can just avoid them for a while. I'm just going to keep my distance. I'm going to pretend you're not here. I'm going to give you the cold shoulder maybe for a little while. So we have these options to us. There are ways to respond. but gracious couples forgive one another. Here is a definition of forgiveness. Like I said, we're going to do a psychological and a theological perspective on forgiveness. I'm saying psychological, but really it's a therapeutic definition of forgiveness. And that is to say, like, if I were to go to a counselor and say, I want to work on being more forgiving, that counselor would probably use a therapeutic model of forgiveness. So, and I'm jumping ahead. So it's an interpersonal, it's a process of pursuing. I said all this stuff and I forgot I was supposed to press the buttons. Of pursuing and experiencing. So again, pursuing means I'm doing it on purpose. And while I do it on purpose, I experience change. If you lift weights, you get stronger. If you pursue forgiveness, you get more forgiving. It's not a secret. Again, it's not easy, but it's not a secret. Positive change, the change that you want to have in how you think about, feel toward, and behave toward the person who has offended against you, or in this case, Steve. Sorry. I need to change the name, Steve. Sorry. All right. Let me give you, so that's a psychological definition of forgiveness. Let me talk about a theology of forgiveness. And I think that really illuminates, like the treasure of forgiveness, the gift of forgiveness. And I think gift is the right word. On Sunday, I'm going to describe forgiveness as a gift, and I think it's the right word. I have worked with lots of people who they're like, I want to forgive. This other person hurt me. I could use Sally. Sally is saying, Steve hurt me, and I want to forgive. And it's been difficult. I don't like the way that I feel about Steve. I don't like the way that I feel. I don't like the way that I treat him. I don't like the way that I'm thinking about him. I want to feel differently. I want to forgive because it is a gift for me. And I want to give that gift also to Steve. And Steve is saying, I can't believe what I did. I hurt Sally. I have this guilt and shame associated with my behavior. And I know it was my fault. If only she could forgive me. It's a gift. And it's one of those gifts that I think people don't know how to ask for. They don't know that they need it. They're like, I know I feel terrible, but I don't know how to ask for or how to bequest the gift of forgiveness. But I think it's one of those, like, people want it. And they just don't have a language for it sometimes. They don't know what it is that they're asking for, what they need. But it's longed for. It's a gift that is longed for. All right, so here's a brief theology. And when I say a brief theology, I'm going to review like the ways that forgiveness is described in the Bible. So there are a number of different words in the Old Testament and the New Testament that are translated as forgive. So if you're just reading your English language translation of the Bible, you're going to see the word forgive lots of times, but it's not always the same word. And also, I don't speak Hebrew or Greek, so if I mispronounce these, just tough luck. But to bear in the Old Testament, oh my gosh, look at all the notes I got to skip over. This is Nasa. We see this in Genesis 4:13. Cain has killed Abel. God has banished Cain. And Cain says, my punishment is more than I can bear. This punishment is too heavy for me. I can't carry it. When God leads Abram into the promised land, and Abram doesn't know it yet, God says, lift up your eyes and look around. This is where your descendants will live. So like to bear or to lift up or to carry, that is one expression of forgiveness. So you have someone who is the offended, Sally, is going to bear the weight of Steve's offense. She's going to take it off Steve and bear it herself. So to forgive is for the offended to bear the weight of the offense. The second is to release a prisoner. So we see this in Leviticus. Leviticus will often have, so we have lots and lots of formulas in Leviticus, and I'm not quite sure that formulas is the best word for this, but God says, do this, and then your sins will be atoned for, and you will be forgiven. And so we have this combination of like atonement and forgiveness kind of put together in a couplet, if you will. And sometimes the word that is atonement is translated forgive, and then sometimes the word that is forgive is the word that is translated forgive. And so in Leviticus, you often have this formula where God says, do this, your sins will be atoned for, and then you will be released. And that's where we get the released part. So the forgiveness here is that a prisoner who is guilty is released. Ashley and I were talking about this last night. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. But I suggested it to you guys if you read the devotions, and I know you all did carefully, all of you. One of the things I suggested in the devotions was that lots of us have kind of had this experiential forgiveness of getting away with something. My first car was a 1978 Datsun 510. And if you can't picture that, it fell apart around me, like literally fell apart around me. The windows fell off. And that's not an exaggeration. The roof fell in, but I got it up to 120 miles per hour one time. It was a beautiful day, open highway, no one else out there, and the speedometer topped out at 120, and I topped it out, and it was fantastic. I didn't get pulled over, I didn't wreck, I didn't hit anybody, nothing bad happened. I was released. I committed a sin, and I was released from that. I didn't think about that like in the moment as I got forgiven for this bad decision. But I mean, you can think about how many things that you've done. Don't name them. How many things you've done in your life that you're like, I got away with it. That could have gone differently. That could have ended bad for me or for someone else. I was released from the consequences of a bad decision. All right, so we have two word pictures for forgiveness in the Old Testament so far. We have the offended is bearing the weight of the offense, or the offended is releasing the offender from the punishment. The third way is this. So I said atone and forgive. This is the atone part, but it is also sometimes, not very often, translated as forgive, and that is kafar. And this, I didn't press the button. Oh, I did. I went too far. Okay, let's go back and forth. All right, let's do the debt one. Sorry, I jumped ahead. Oh, my notes are out of order. Okay, I did not press that button. All right. I'm sorry. We're going to do this one for a second. So this is in the Old Testament. The debt one is in the New Testament. I'm not quite sure how I got them out of order there. So to kafar something is the idea of covering up something that is a blemish or, very literally like a hole in the boat. It shows up for Noah, like God is like build an ark and then cover it with pitch, like cover it with tar. It's like what made a boat watertight. You put the tar on the outside and it covered up the blemishes and kept out the water. And so atone here, it shows up in Leviticus repeatedly, sacrifice this animal and then pour out the animal's blood. So very literally, cover up the sin with the blood. That is the kafar. You're atoning. The blemish or the sin becomes invisible because it's covered. You see where this is going. Right? This is the atonement. So to atone is also to forget. Now I do need to point this out. The kafar part is only ever expressed by God. God never asked humans to kafar one another or to offer, you don't kafar for anybody or, you don't do it for them or to them. Only God offers atonement. So that's a little bit different. Okay. In the New Testament, specifically Matthew and Luke, we have Jesus talking about forgiveness periodically. And somehow I lost this page in my notes. Here it is. He's using the word, I don't even know, aphiemi. So when he, in the Lord's Prayer, where he says, forgive our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us, or in the parable of the unmerciful servant, the rich ruler forgives the debts of one of his servants, but then that servant doesn't forgive the debt of a fellow servant. That's the aphiemi, so it is to forgive a debt. So, I've already alluded to this, but if Sally forgives Steve's debt, what happens to the debt? It goes to Sally. Yeah, it's gone. It's gone from Steve's ledger, but it costs Sally. So to forgive a debt is costly. And I think you know that. If you incur a debt and someone says, that's all right, it's forgiven. This is what happens in the parable of the unmerciful servant. The rich ruler says, your debts are forgiven. Which means the ruler is I lost it. That is my loss. In forgiving you, I am agreeing to accept that loss. So we said grace makes us vulnerable. We might end up bearing a burden that we didn't pack. We might end up taking on a debt that we didn't incur. It makes us vulnerable. It is to forgive a debt. And then finally, when we get into the epistles, Paul exclusively describes forgiveness in terms of charis, which we later becomes charity. This is what we understand as charity. Paul is emphasizing the freeness of the gift. To forgive someone else is to offer them a grace gift with no strings attached. All right, so we have bearing a burden, forgiving a debt, releasing a prisoner freely. I was going to say any questions, but I'm not going to do that. Okay, that's my instinct. All right, let's talk about a couple of things that forgiveness is not. And again, if you get into the therapeutic literature of forgiveness, if you just go Google what is forgiveness, I think like the first 2 or 3 like responses you're gonna get are like, well, forgiveness is not this. Like people are really worried that we're gonna make forgiveness too big. We're gonna start giving it away. I'm not joking. I mean, people are worried about that. Like therapists are worried. Commentators are worried. When I said earlier that like the new relationship advice is dump him, like the singular like guide star of 21st century mental health is if anyone hurts you, cut them out of your life. Get rid of them. Don't forgive. That's unhealthy. You're just making yourself vulnerable. And I'm emphasizing that because I want you to get like the counterculturalness of this, the illogic of it. So I think on the one hand, it is logical in the sense that marriages don't work without it. But on the other hand, it is illogical because why should the person who didn't pack the bag carry the bag? Why should the person who didn't incur the debt take on the cost of the debt? They shouldn't. They're giving it to the offender as a gift, as grace. So it's not about a should, it's they can. Okay, now with all that said, I'm going to say some of the things that forgiveness is not, but I've also got some buts in there. So forgiveness is not reconciling. And what I mean by that is that these are 2 distinct processes. So to forgive someone doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to enter into a relationship with them, or that the relationship that you once had with them is going to be restored the same way that it once was. And I'm thinking about, like, let's imagine you get hacked by Russian hackers and they steal all your financial information. And you're like angry about it, and you're like, I'm not talking to those Russian hackers again. Well, you might get over your anger. You might feel less angry over time. I don't even know if you would forgive them or not, but you're probably not going to reconcile with them. You're not going to like call them up in Russia and like, hey, I need to forgive you guys. Let's get together. These are distinct processes. We can think about them as being distinct, but forgiveness is for reconciliation. Like, God gave us forgiveness so that we could be reconciled with Him. And He gave us forgiveness in the church so that we could be reconciled to one another. They are distinct processes. They're not one and the same, but one is for the other, and especially in marriage. Why do we forgive in marriage? So that we can be reconciled to one another. So they're distinct. It's not reconciliation, but it's for that. Forgiveness is not condoning or approving. In fact, it cannot be. You can't forgive something that you approve of. You have to, in order to forgive something, you have to name it as an offense. Like, that was wrong. That was hurtful. And I'm going to add this little piece here. Not just hurtful, it was wrong. You erred. So it's not approval. To forgive someone is not to say, it's okay. It's not okay. By definition, if it's okay, it doesn't need to be forgiven. So it's not approving and it's not condoning. And I think some people are worried about that. They're like, if we forgive one another, we're really just condoning one another's behavior. And that's not it. You're naming it. And you're naming it wrong. And then forgiving even though. It's also not ignoring, and I think I've kind of already said this, like you can't ignore an offense and forgive it. You can't pretend it's not there and forgive it. Forgiveness is an active process. Now, it is true that over time, our hurt feelings tend to become less hurt. We tend to become less angry. We tend to become less vengeful. So it is true that our feelings change over time. And maybe we can kind of like, I'm going to muddle through. But it's not ignoring. You can't forgive something that you don't acknowledge. The pain of an injury, if you twist your ankle, the pain of that injury might fade over time. But that's not the same thing as treating the injury. And with forgiveness, we're talking about treating the injury, not just hoping that the pain fades over time. All right, and it's also not abdicating growth. And what I mean by that is if Sally, man, this time goes fast. If Sally forgives Steve, she is not saying to Steve, Steve, I forgive you. Now we have nothing else to talk about. She's saying, I forgive you. You're released from your debt. You're released from the punishment. But we need to talk about how things are going to be in the future. Steve can grow from this. He can repent, which we're going to talk about later, and he can change, and he can grow. So to forgive is not to say we don't have anything to talk about anymore about this event. We're going to keep talking about it on into the future. So I think sometimes, especially in the therapeutic literature, and you may have encountered this, if you're on Instagram, you've encountered this, like people are worried about forgiveness. Like, oh, don't forgive, it's unhealthy. Because, you have to reconcile, and really it's just condoning or ignoring. And if you forgive someone, they're not going to grow or change or learn anything. None of those things are true. All right, let's see what I got next. Oh, I forgot about this. All right, I got to take a drink. Forgiveness is not fair. And I think I've said that already, right? Several times in different ways. When we have an offense, I always look at that one. When we have an offense, we have an injustice gap. So Steve has offended against Sally, and they are separated by this gap of injustice. If that gap is closed, and what I mean by that is if somehow Steve could make restitution, and he could say, your feelings aren't hurt, anything that you lost is restored, there's nothing to forgive. Forgiveness only occurs when there is an injustice gap. You've taken something from me, you've hurt me, you've exposed my vulnerability in some way, and that gap can't be closed. I made light of Russian hackers a moment ago. Even, so I get hacked, I hope not. I get hacked by the Russians, they empty out my bank accounts. And for whatever reason, the Justice Department does their job, and they're like, hey, we've recovered all your money. And I get all the money back into my bank accounts. I'm still upset. Like that's an upsetting experience. Like my vulnerability has been exposed. Even if we can make restitution after an offense, which, and I'm saying even if, we can't, right? Most of the time we can't. Very rarely can we actually like, oh, I'm going to make it up to you. We can't. There is a gap that says I cannot make this up to you. And so the only way we go forward is if you, Sally, bridge the gap with forgiveness. Forgiveness is the thing that lets us get over the injustice gap. But the point here is that forgiveness is not fair. Steve cannot deserve forgiveness. If he deserves forgiveness, there's nothing to forgive. You cannot deserve forgiveness. Oh, there it is. Injustice gap. That's what I just said. Okay, I want to talk, this is a little asterisk, about bearing. And what I mean by this is that there are some things that happen in ongoing relationships, like marriage, that are irritations that aren't necessarily offenses. So I know that sometimes I snore. I'm not trying to do it. I'm not like, I'm going to go to sleep tonight and Ashley is not going to see this coming. I'm not trying to do it. But it interferes with her sleep. It's irritating, which I understand. It's irritating. And so, like, forgiveness isn't quite the right choice here. She's not like, you have offended against me, I offer gracefully to you forgiveness. But she can gracefully bear with me. Paul often instructs us to bear with one another. And what he's saying is, like, you guys are going to irritate each other in the church and in your marriage. Every so once in a while, you're going to irritate one another. This isn't an offense, but it's irritating. You don't necessarily need to forgive it. You can bear with it. You just say, I wish this were a little different. Ashley wishes I did not snore. Tough luck. Not exactly. We bought one of the beds that do the tilty. This is a commercial. They're great. The tilty beds are great. So I said the other day, or maybe this morning, 2/3 of all conflict is perpetual conflict. So if there is this, like, your mom just doesn't like me, and Steve says to Sally, your mom just doesn't like me. Every time we go to Christmas, she gives me a hard time. So I know. And I wish it were different. We're going to have to bear with it. We're going to keep talking about it. We're not going to pretend it doesn't exist. We're not going to pretend it's not irritating, but we're going to have to bear with it. So sometimes bearing is the right choice. All right, so I've said forgiveness is often the right choice. Often bearing is the right choice. I want to give you 3 indicators, like, is forgiveness the right choice? And one is that there is a specific offense, an event that occurs that is nameable. Like, on this date, you did this thing, and it hurt me. It was an offense against me. Not, you don't fold your laundry right. That's something we bear with. That's not a specific offense. A specific, nameable offense. And that it hurts. Not, it was a little bit irritating, but it hurt. And it changed my feelings toward you. I'm less motivated to be around you. I want to avoid you instead of be around you. I feel less benevolent toward you. And maybe I'm thinking about getting even. So my feelings have changed toward you as a result of this hurt. The third is depersonalization. All right, I know I'm out of time. We are going to do call and response real quick. What do you call someone who steals? A thief. What do you call someone who cheats? What do you call someone who lies? We don't call them humans. We're people. We tend to depersonalize those who offend against us. They are things or characters rather than people. And I'm saying that to say, all of us know, don't tell us, you all know that you have been an offender. At some point in your life, you've been the offender. I have been the offender. And you know you're a person. You're like, it's not who I think I am. I'm not a liar and a cheater and a thief. but I was the offender on this occasion. I'm a person who did something wrong that was hurtful. So when we have depersonalized that person, then we especially know that forgiveness is appropriate. All right, it is time for table talk.